Now, we may be certain that the United States will not become a huge Haiti. Its territory is too valuable, and it is coveted. If the Americans continue to submit to the world government that it now effectively rules us in all but name and a few formalities, then certainly after the savages have done the work for which they have been trained, and after the Occidental population of the United States has been mongrelized, defiled, and beaten down to the level of cringing and mindless animals, fit only to work for their masters with the resignation of horses and oxen, then world government will surely dispose of the savages, for which it will have no further use. That's what one should expect. Many years ago, I read about a murder ingeniously committed in the early years of this century. A man decided to kill his business partner. So he bought a good dog, trained it to bite on command, and invited his partner for dinner. Just before the partner arrived, he coated the dog's teeth with a serum containing the infection of rabies. And when the partner entered the house, the dog, on command, bit him. Then the murderer shot his dog. We may be sure that world government will shoot its dog after the dog has served his purpose. But that will not do us any good. We will be dead, or at least wish we were. The other possibility, of course, is that white Americans will at long last try to defend themselves and even to recover their independence. That will cost them blood and tears, much blood and many tears. But in the past, certainly, our race was willing to fight for survival, and it may therefore again prefer to fight rather than to submit to ignominious slavery and whimpering extinction. Our problem, then, is to calculate the probability that the Occidentals in the United States will try to resist while they still have a chance of success, and the probability that their resistance will be effective and ultimately successful. That is our problem. I regret that I do not know the answer. I cannot measure the latent forces that may still be present in the minds and souls of Americans. And without measurement of all the vectors, I cannot compute either the direction or the velocity of the resulting movement. All that I can do now is to tell you what I regard as the critical vector. If the force along it that is released is great, we may win. If it is small, there is very little hope for us. I suggest that this is the aspect of the situation that you should most carefully watch for developments if you want to see how things are going. Now, it is customary in patriotic and conservative meetings to speak about the enemy. There are, of course, the two general approaches. The first is that which attempts to provide the audience with two-thirds of the piece of the jigsaw puzzle, speaking endlessly about the horrors of Bolshevism and the cunning of Bolsheviks, and what is said is, of course, both frightening and true. That would make the evil begin with Karl Marx and leave people with the mystery how such a wretched degenerate could possibly have influenced the history of the world. That is, of course, a very favorite approach. When the little hirelings of the liberal press and radio try to ridicule us, they say that we expect to find a communist under every bed. They'd be quite right to laugh at us if we did anything so ridiculous. The space under the beds these days is all occupied by staunch conservatives and patriots who are afraid to look out and see who is in the room. There are, of course, more thorough and more advanced treatments of the problem, but they again concentrate our attention on the phenomenal cunning and satanic evil of our enemies. I agree that they must be almost infinitely evil and wicked in terms of the morality of Western man. But I cannot avoid the reflection that while rabbits undoubtedly believe that wolves are extremely wicked, wolves do not share that opinion. There is, of course, a certain comfort in blaming the enemy for all our losses and all our defeats, but that cannot be the whole story. It takes only one side to start a war, but it takes two sides to make a victory for one. Although I certainly applaud and endorse every effort to expose and denounce our enemies, I think that we foredoom ourselves to failure if we do not once in a while undertake the more embarrassing and painful task of determining what weaknesses in ourselves made their success possible. If, as we say, they have constantly deluded and deceived us, we are no doubt entitled to speak harshly of them and even to curse them. But we'd better also be ashamed of ourselves that we were so easily and so frequently and so constantly deluded and deceived. We men of the West are a peculiar people, basically unlike all other races in our instincts, our predilections, and our mode of thinking. And we shall have to study ourselves very carefully if we intend to survive on this overcrowded planet. One of our most remarkable and disastrous peculiarities, a weakness found to that extent in no other race, is our willful and perverse disregard of even the most obvious facts about the great and unalterable differences between races. It is, I fear, an inveterate failing of ours. And if you wish to study a fairly early and very good example of its consequences, consider what happened to the Aryans who invaded and conquered India, only to disappear and be absorbed in a vast and fantastically prolific mass of mongrels. An entirely different approach, but yet a very interesting contribution to our thinking on that subject, in a connection that is less well known, would be a consideration of the Greek world. And for that I would recommend a critical, very critical reading of the recent book by Michael Astur, Hellenosemitica, published in Leiden 2 years ago. Now, our delusions on the subject of race spring partly from a curious will to believe that others are like ourselves, and partly from a superficial and unthinking observation of other peoples. For one thing, we seem invariably to succumb to the flattery of imitation. The capacity for imitating behavior is common not only to all human beings, but to all anthropoids. As we know from the proverbial expression, monkey see, monkey do. An ape's capacity to imitate is limited, of course, by its inability to speak, but within that limit it is fairly good. Some years ago I saw, and perhaps you did also, a chimpanzee who gave on the stage recognizable imitations of the characteristic movements and gestures of some comedians that were then well known in the cinema. Among human beings, the capacity for imitation is lowest among the australoids, who are the lowest existing form of human life. We possess it to a considerable degree. The capacity for imitation and deceit is found in the highest degree among the two most talented Oriental peoples, the Jews and the Japanese, whose abilities in such matters far surpass our own. But all races can imitate us well enough to deceive careless observers. If they dress in our clothes, observe our social conventions, and speak our language, using the phrases and cliches which, as they can learn from observation, please us, the members of any other race can imitate us so plausibly that we imagine that they have been converted to our mentality and to our conception of life. And any shortcomings that we may notice in the performance, we generously overlook or regard as endearing naivete. The capacity for imitation possessed by at least the more intelligent savages has deceived us time after time. The British are as gullible as we are, and hundreds of times they gave scholarships to Congoloids from Basutoland or Kenya or Nigeria or one of their other possessions, and the result was generally the same. With the money and tutoring given him, the savage bought a good wardrobe, attended an English school, learned to play soccer, went to Oxford and wrote a charming essay on Wordsworth or on Gresham's Law, copulated with half-witted English females who thought themselves intellectual because they were as undiscriminating as the very lowest class of prostitutes. And then, when the savage got tired of living on English generosity and carrying on the pretense, he went home. And if he thought himself safely beyond the reach of his imperialistic oppressors, he had a well-roasted baby served up to him as a delicacy, of which he had long been deprived by the stupid prejudices of the bigoted British. But what most effectively